Chapter 36. The Royal Fugitive. Paris, June 1791. Receipts. Dozens of them, crumpled invoices, fading shipping manifests, all of it completely useless. This was what he had nearly gotten arrested for? Thomas spread them across the floor like some pathetic archive of his father's neglected estate, hoping in vain for a single scrap of meaning. But nothing he found bore Adi's name. No contracts, no clues. He let out a bitter exhale and leaned back against the bedchamber wall. The thrill of the day's earlier victory had dulled entirely. The room was dim now that the sun had fully set. A few hours ago, he had reclaimed his childhood kingdom, but scavenging the study had been in vain. The document he needed remained completely out of reach, at least until his lawyer could intervene. He gathered the scattered papers to return them to the drawer, when he realized there was one he had missed. Something thin was stuck to the back of a receipt for an amber gemstone. He peeled it away and found a small, unaddressed letter, no more than half the size of standard parchment, stamped with his father's signet. Thomas ran his thumb over the crimson seal. It felt wrong to open a dead man's unsent correspondence, but then again, who would ever know? He cracked the wax and bent the page ajar. It was not at all what he had been looking for, but its contents were equally vexing. Marie Suzette, I think I'm going to die soon. I don't expect you to mourn me. I know I have done nothing to deserve that, but I am realizing, very suddenly, that I have some regrets. Perhaps it is a fear that the God I have abandoned as fiction may very well be waiting for me, and if he is, I doubt he sees me with favor. We did not do very well together in the end. Your dreams were so beautifully simple, and perhaps, if that had been enough for me, we both could have found happiness with each other. I am not the kind of man to apologize. I don't think I would mean it if I did. But I wanted you to know that, as I lie here, on the brink of death, it is your face that I wished to see. Goodbye, Antoine. Thomas read it again, his pulse rising with each pass. What in God's name was that letter? He hadn't even sent it. His father had written his mother one final letter, addressed it to no one, and offered no real remorse. No apology, no attempt to right the wrongs he had inflicted, not even in death. Did the will become his penance? Or had God watched Antoine write the letter and interceded on his mother's behalf? Thomas let out a perturbed exhale. Even beyond the grave, his father never ceased to infuriate. Yet Antoine hadn't always been like that. There were moments, fleeting but real, when Thomas was young, when he could have sworn his parents had loved each other. Perhaps it was the naive imaginings of his young mind, but he had never believed his father to be monstrous until the day he disavowed them all to become a marquis. Thomas slumped into a chair, his eyes falling out of focus as another thought struck him. Was history repeating itself? Would he, newly titled, let ambition make him cruel? Would he forget Marie-Louise, forget what mattered, just as his father had? He had barely been Marquis again for a day, but he had already, committed the crime of breaking and entering. He let out a bitter grunt and kicked the desk drawer with his bare foot. The bloody thing nearly lifted off his toenail. Without thinking, he seized the letter and threw it into the fire, using every piece of his energy to hold in a scream and not awaken his fellow soldiers down the hall. With his toe pulsing in pain, he watched in silence as the red wax bubbled and the parchment blackened, curling inward on itself, flaking away to ash. Perhaps he shouldn't have burned it. His mother had the right to read it, but it was too late now. He collapsed onto his bed. But sleep didn't come. His mind was spinning with more ferocity than Athena and Arachne combined. To accept the Marquisate meant becoming a target in the revolution that was already vitriolic against the nobility. Even the gendarme had barely tolerated him today. But without the estate, without the title, he had nothing. No money to marry or pay a lawyer or free the people he loved. Only this inheritance would give him that sort of capital. Furthermore, La Guinaudet was a bargaining chip his mother said she needed. If, in fact, the Maubiers were the ones who had her papers of ownership. He reached over and grabbed the last letter his mother had written him. It was filled with hearsay evidence of how the Maubiers had been siphoning the plantation's profits ever since his father died. If she was right, the Maubiers were far more deeply entrenched in Saint-Domingue than he'd realized. But if the house was his, then technically the plantation was too. He could ask his lawyer about reparations for their treachery and thievery. The big question, though, was, did he legally have ownership papers for his mother? Or did they? If it was the Maubiers, then buying her freedom would surely come at a terrible cost. His promotion to corporal in the Paris National Guard was wonderful, of course, but it was still a fairly small paycheck compared to what he required. The thoughts kept circling through his mind well into the night. He was up so late that he missed the call of the town criers and was still tucked obliviously under his blankets at 8:16 in the morning. Thomas woke from his sleep by a frantic knock at the door. He rubbed his eyes, disoriented, before the urgency of the sound brought him fully awake. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and yanked open the door. A young National Guardsman stood there, breathless and wide-eyed. "Corporal Dumas, you're needed urgently by the Marquis de Lafayette." "What happened?" Thomas asked, but the soldier was already gone. He quickly donned his dark blue uniform coat with red facings. As he pulled on his white breeches, he noticed a small stain from yesterday's scuffle. Normally, he would have cleaned it before leaving, but based on the tone of the guardsman's voice, he figured that Lafayette wouldn't be worrying about a little dirt on his breeches. He grabbed his black bicorn hat, adorned with the tricolor cockade of the Revolution, and rushed out the door. He raced down the street towards Lafayette's office. After he had arrived in Paris, Thomas had impressed many people with his military skills. However, his skin remained a barrier to his promotion. That was until he met the Marquis de Lafayette. Perhaps it was because of the time Lafayette spent in America, but after watching Thomas expertly navigate a horse through a riotous street and fire a warning shot that knocked the hat off a straw effigy of the king without harming a soul, the general had offered him a position as aide-de-camp. Thomas had asked him why, and Lafayette's response still held space in his mind. "I have had many men serve under me. None have ever worked harder than the men no one else wanted to believe in." It was an accurate observation, he supposed. Thomas sprinted through the corridors of the headquarters, his boots slamming against the polished floors. As he turned a corner on the second floor, he noticed servants whispering in hushed panic. Lafayette's door was straight ahead. He knocked loudly, the sound echoing down the marble hall. But it was not Lafayette who opened the door. The mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, peered his head cautiously outside. "It's your black aide," the mayor called to his men in the room. "Let him in," came Lafayette's voice from inside. Thomas stepped into the room. The door closed sharply behind him. The air was tense. 8 men stood in the cramped office, most in high-ranking military or civic dress. Lafayette stood near his desk, arms braced against its surface. Bailly hovered nearby, his fingers twitching. 3 officers in epaulets were posted silently along the wall. At the center of the room stood a stranger who was clearly the center of attention. "I need to think," Lafayette said. "Tell it to me again, Lemoyne, from the beginning." "Yes, General," the man replied stiffly. Thomas studied the man named Lemoyne. He wore a navy livery coat embroidered with silver fleur-de-lis of the Bourbon line. His cravat was perfectly fluffed and his powdered wig was tied back with a silver ribbon. Even before Thomas noticed the royal insignia on his buttons, he knew Monsieur Lemoyne must be a royal valet, one who had been in His Majesty's service for some time, by Thomas' estimation. "At 7 this morning," Lemoyne began, "as always, I entered His Majesty's chambers to prepare him for the day. I drew the curtains, but he was gone." Thomas' jaw dropped. He really was walking into a serious situation. The rest of the people in the room seemed already appraised. "Naturally, we were worried, but we thought perhaps the king had awoken early. It would be most unusual, but not any more unusual than His Majesty simply being absent. So I sent Hubert to check on the Dauphin and ask the guards about his whereabouts so I could bring him breakfast." Lemoyne stopped, swallowing loudly. "I went about my morning duties. I noticed the chamber pot was empty, which was also unusual, but I started to make the bed. Then Hubert came back in, interrupting my work. He told me the Dauphin was also missing. He was in a panic. I will admit, I was getting worried myself. Hubert then asked if we should check on the Queen." "And remind me," Lafayette interrupted. "Why didn't you check on her immediately?" "You have to understand, General," Lemoyne said defensively. "Her Majesty does not permit being disturbed before 8. Even in circumstances this suspicious," Mayor Bailly pressed. "The royal schedule is sacred and cannot be tampered with," Lemoyne snapped back. "Fine, but when you checked on the Queen at 8 o'clock, she was also missing, correct?" Lafayette asked. "Yes," Lemoyne said quietly. There was a knock on the door. It was a second valet, slightly younger, who clutched a paper tightly in his fist. He was breathing heavily, as if he had run the entire way here. "Hubert?" Lemoyne asked, surprised. Lafayette narrowed his eyes. "You're the other valet?" "Yes, General," Hubert confirmed. "Come in," Lafayette ordered. Hubert stepped forward and bowed. "I found this in His Majesty's chambers," he said, holding out the letter. "And I compiled a list of items the king appears to have taken with him." Lafayette took the letter and unfolded it slowly. As he read, his eyes widened. "You're certain this was left in the king's room?" he demanded. "Yes, General." Lafayette turned to the room. "The king denounces the Revolution. He denounces the Jacobins. He disavows the very reforms we've bled to enact." He looked up. "I don't think we can come to any other conclusion. The king has fled." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. We mustn't let this reach the people, Bailey said quickly. The convention is only days away from finalizing the new constitution. If this gets out... I know. I understand, Lafayette said as he paced the office. If the people lose faith now, the Republic could collapse before it even begins. I said, I understand, Lafayette snapped. He turned to Bailey. You handle the public response. He turned to Thomas with deadly calm. We need to find the king. Gather intelligence. Start with the king's guard. I want full reports in my hand within the hour. Thomas nodded. Lafayette gripped his arm. And I trust you understand the importance of discretion in this matter. I'll be careful who I speak with, Thomas said formally. Then he bowed and closed the door behind him. 1 hour. Time was not on his side. Through the closed door, Thomas could still hear Bailey discussing damage control, but a quick glance down the hall at the whispering staff made him highly doubt that this secret would be long kept, no matter how subtle they tried to be. Whatever the officials hoped to contain, the city would soon know. And by 11 that morning, it did. Word of the king's escape was racing through the streets. Thomas wasted no time. He began interrogating staff at the Palais des Tuileries, where the royal family had been housed since returning from Versailles. Thankfully, the king had not been as prudent as he thought. The queen's chambermaid pointed Thomas to a stable hand who confirmed that the king, queen, and dauphin had fled under cover of night. A few sleepy guards remembered seeing 3 cloaked riders heading north just after midnight. Working quickly with the local gendarme, Thomas even managed to locate the king's carriage. The king had traveled separately from his possessions for expediency, leaving his trunks in the hand of one of his loyal advisors. The advisor had been detained in Chantry and was now en route with a mounted escort to return to the city with the king's belongings for a full interrogation. Though Thomas had sent several soldiers to Lafayette throughout the morning with written updates, he believed the time had come to brief the general in person. However, the palace was no longer easy to access. What had begun with a few quiet protesters earlier in the day had grown into a full mob. Crowds packed the Place du Carrousel, chanting, shouting, and pressing up against the gates. What should have been a 5-minute walk from the stables now took close to 30 as Thomas fought his way through the crowd. He reached the palace doors and slipped back inside. Lafayette had been using the dining room as his makeshift command post. Thomas headed there first. He gave a sharp knock, then entered without waiting for a response. To his surprise, only 2 men were inside, Lafayette and an American that Thomas recognized from earlier meetings, though they'd never spoken. He was a member of the National Assembly, despite his loud Bostonian accent. "The king's security was my responsibility, Thomas," Lafayette was saying to the American. "The Assembly specifically tasked me with this." Thomas Alexandre cleared his throat. Lafayette turned. "Ah, Dumas, I hope you bring good news. Thomas, this is my aide-de-camp, Corporal Thomas Alexandre Dumas. Dumas, this is Thomas Paine." "Your reputation precedes you," Dumas said, offering a polite bow. "You worry too much, Lafayette," Paine continued, brushing the concern aside. "It's not your head on the chopping block," Lafayette muttered. "This is a good thing," Paine retorted. "Fleeing Paris makes the king look cowardly and guilty. It validates your revolution." "Regardless," Lafayette said, "I still have to catch him." "Do you, though?" Lafayette blinked. "How can you say that?" "Let him go. Exile him. He has friends in America. I could draft something in the Assembly, make it sound like our idea." It is one thing to keep the man under guard where we can control him. It is entirely another to have him running rogue through our countryside, Lafayette scoffed. I have an update on that, actually, Thomas interjected. Tell me, Lafayette said, ignoring his friend. The king went north. He rode ahead of his carriage and got out of the city quickly with the queen and Dauphin. The carriage with his belongings was apprehended, and the driver with it. My men are en route with the carriage driver, who most certainly knows where His Majesty is headed, at least provided the king intended to reunite with his trunks outside of Paris. Additionally, reports have arrived that a governess with a peculiar likeness to Her Majesty attempted to bribe a local official, a fromentière, with silver dishes. Excellent, Lafayette said. Well done, Dumas. Thank you, sir, but you should know the crowd outside the palace is growing rapidly. I know, Lafayette rubbed his forehead. Why don't you take a few men and settle them down? You want me to lead the effort? Thomas asked, startled. You're the only one who won't muck it up, Lafayette replied. Thank you, General, Thomas said, fighting to suppress the pride welling in his chest. This could mean a promotion for him. Keep it orderly. I'll be out after I finish questioning the driver. When is he due to arrive? Within the hour. Good, Lafayette nodded. At least someone in this room is dependable, unlike these double-crossing Americans, Lafayette said, shooting a snide look at Payne. Well, technically, I am almost an American, Thomas mumbled, not entirely sure why he felt the need to self-deprecatingly interject. Saint-Domingue doesn't count, Payne replied. Besides, I'm not double-crossing. The pact was forged with the old regime, and you don't seem to have the king's best interests at heart. Not that I blame you. His Majesty is no friend of mine. And yet you always manage to benefit from the chaos, Lafayette muttered as Thomas Alexandre slipped out. Outside, the crowd had swelled and grown fanatical, yelling insults that would have made anyone of good family blush. It wasn't easy, but Thomas managed to keep them from tipping into violence, which, for Paris these days, counted as a resounding success. Meanwhile, the king's carriage returned to the stables, and Thomas carved a path through the growing crowd to allow the National Guardsmen to escort the driver into the palace. What he wouldn't give to be inside that room, watching Lafayette interrogate the man. But Thomas remained stationed outside, managing the throngs. Later that night, he learned the interrogation had ended quickly. The driver gave Lafayette everything. The king was captured in Varennes-en-Argonne before the sun had even set. Apparently, he'd tried to disguise himself as a butler, but neither Louis nor Marie-Antoinette had any understanding of how ordinary Frenchmen lived. Their disguises were embarrassingly unconvincing. With the king absent, Paris turned on its head, and Lafayette and the National Assembly went into full damage control. They didn't want the monarchy to appear weak or treacherous, so while they ignored Payne's suggestion to exile the king outright, they did instruct the Assembly to draft a public statement. According to their proclamation, the king had been kidnapped against his will. Obviously, no one believed it. Word of the king's letter had already gotten out. When the Assembly tried to claim the letter was fake, planted by a rogue minister trying to force the king's abdication, the public simply scoffed. The damage had been done. Thomas was no royalist, so the Assembly's response baffled him. Why try to salvage the monarch's reputation? Louis hadn't truly ruled in months. He'd been a prisoner at Tuileries in all but name, and the Assembly had long been calling the shots. But he was still the king. It felt odd. Both Lafayette and Payne had helped push the Americans to separate from the British king, but neither man seemed eager to be truly rid of Louis XVI. Perhaps it was because the Americans didn't actually dethrone their monarch. They just removed his colonial claim. For Lafayette, the reason seemed primarily religious. The divine right of kings. But Paine, ironically, despised that notion, yet even he wasn't ready to fully push the crown off its pedestal. Thomas couldn't understand their reasoning, but he didn't think any one person should have that sort of unilateral power over a helpless people. Still, Lafayette and Paine were behemoths. Questioning them publicly would have been unwise, even as discontent swelled in the streets. The Assembly's story faltered. Trust in the monarchy shattered. And suddenly, it was not just safe, but fashionable to call for the king's removal. What once might have gotten someone hanged for treason was now spoken aloud in the cafes and shouted in the streets with abandon. Paris had been reborn. Protests against the king became commonplace, and no one was louder than a relatively unknown lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre. As Paris waited for the king's return, Robespierre seized the moment. He delivered a blistering speech in the National Assembly, accusing nearly every member, including Lafayette and Paine, of being counter-revolutionaries. He called for the total abolition of the monarchy, the end of aristocratic privileges, and even demanded universal suffrage and the elimination of the French slave trade. Honestly, Thomas found himself agreeing with much of his speech. He admired Robespierre's clarity and conviction, but he still had a deep respect for Lafayette. Thomas would never be so uncouth as to vocalize support for Robespierre when he had made an enemy of the only man who ever believed in him. Still, Robespierre's words echoed in Thomas' mind long after the speech ended. It took 4 days for the king to return, and it was probably for the best. Paris needed time to prepare, especially now that the people had lost trust in the king. To many Parisians, it was the king himself who committed treason against France. In anticipation of the king's return, Lafayette had signs posted all throughout Paris and read out loud in every square, repeated before the convoy arrived. The signs warned, "Whoever applauds the king shall be flogged. Whoever insults him shall be hanged." Thomas rode near the front of the king's escort, part of a 6,000-man cavalcade assigned to ensure the monarch's safe return to Paris. The procession was so formal and solemn that an unknowing bystander would probably have thought it to be a funeral. Despite thousands of soldiers and tens of thousands of onlookers watching the king's carriage roll through the streets of Paris, the only sounds heard were the clapping of shoes of the horses' hooves against the cobblestones.